result. And Eric, I think it's time for us to begin.
Yeah, time to begin with a conversation with Cass.
Great. And we'll see you shortly.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is with great pleasure that we welcome Cass Sunstein, a giant in the field of behavioral science, indeed, for our opening keynote of the Human Advantage Conference 2024. We are honored and very excited to have you back to the Human Advantage Conference and have the opportunity to speak with you.
Thank you, my friend. It's fantastic to be here and full of admiration and awe for everything you do. And to get to talk about these issues is just a thrill. So thanks.
Great to have you back with us, Cass. We'd like to start our conversation by talking about your new book that Eric just mentioned, How to Become Famous, which is pretty intriguing. What inspired you to write on this particular topic of fame? A bit of a maybe departure from what we're familiar to reading from you.
Completely, though the book has a few secret agendas. I'll tell you the origin, and then I'll tell you a bit about the secret agendas. So I worked in the Biden administration full-time in the first year plus. I'm still working in the Biden administration part-time. When I shifted, I became permitted to write, though not about government matters. They're ethics rules. And I noticed there is a journal called the Journal of Beatles Studies, and I thought it would be really fun to write for the Journal of Beatles Studies. The problem is that while I'm a big fan of the Beatles, my knowledge of music is extremely limited. So I ventured a paper with the kind indulgence of the editor that tried to engage musical issues, and it was so terrible I've shown it to no one. It is on this laptop, and it's very, very bad. Having failed that at music, I tried to investigate something else, which is Beatlemania. How did Beatlemania come to exist? Which is really an issue about success, including emphatically business success. It's also an issue about fame. There is a mania involving MacBook Airs. There's a mania involving Google as a search engine. There's a mania involving certain refrigerators and televisions. There's a behavioral economics mania, no question about that. And how did all this happen? So I wrote a little paper, and as one does in the world of obscure academic life, I put it on the Social Science Research Network. And to my amazement and astonishment, my little paper was covered in The Guardian in the UK, in Scientific American, and in the New York Times. And this was ironic and kind of too perfect that what the paper was about happened on a very small scale to the paper itself. That is, it got a little notorious. And as it did, publishers came to me and said, would you write a book about this? This is the true story. And if someone asked me to write a book about basically anything, including rugs or carpets or blankets, I'll probably say yes to that. And that's the origin of the book.
Great. And we're experiencing some of that mania in this year with Taylor Swift's tour. You know, we're seeing this. We had tectonic activity at 2 of her concerts from the crowds. It's really on a level I think we hadn't expected. Before we hop into the details, Cass, can you give us a quick overview of some key takeaways from the book?
Okay, so the main theme of the book really is that there's an account that's widespread. You can find it basically in any airport book section, that if you isolate certain ingredients of life or determination or business or politics, you can find the well springs of success. So maybe the secret to success is being really impatient. I bet there's a book about that. Or maybe the secret to success is being really disciplined. or maybe the secret to success is being resilient, never giving up. And the theme of the book, number one, is that those books are probably not worth the paper they're written on, though they're extremely charming, and I love them all. Still, they're not correct. That the fact is that many people who are impatient or who are disciplined or who are resilient, they never get anywhere. And the fact is that there are features of success in business and politics, in music and in literature, in salesmanship. There are features that are really important for success, but they do not guarantee success. So that's the negative thesis. The positive thesis is that there's, let's call it a black box, meaning a box that you can't get into very well because it's really dark, which is the box of serendipity. And there are Taylor Swifts. I'm a big fan of Taylor Swift, so I say this with a broken heart. There are Taylor Swifts all around who are maybe working in some company somewhere. They never quite made it. Or maybe they're singing in a small place in Paris and the people hear them go, my gosh, she's amazing. But no one else has heard of them. And I say this with a broken heart because I like to think she's the best there is, give or take a Miley Cyrus. Miley Cyrus is also really good. But life suggests there are people all around who are incredible at one or another thing, some of them at singing, and they just don't make it because the black box of serendipity, let's call it, didn't work out in their favor. And that's a lesson of, let's say, humility for those who do well, and also of generosity, and also of hope that if we give people a chance, maybe they'll invent or market something that is going to turn a lot of lives around.
So let's keep going with this role of serendipity to achieve fame. Can you elaborate on how maybe chance encounters or luck contribute to that fame, or perhaps an example from your research?
Okay, so let's talk, shall we, about that great French band, the Beatles. The Beatles almost failed. They almost gave up because they couldn't get a record deal. The repeated rejections in the United Kingdom meant they could not get a record deal. And both Paul and John said they thought, what are we going to do? I guess we can make it. A few things happened for them. One is Brian Epstein, their manager, was relentless. He happened to like them and kind of adopt them as his project. That could have not happened. And if it hadn't happened, would there have been the Beatles? Probably not. His own confidence and failure ever to give up was really important to the Beatles' success. But it wasn't enough. George Martin, who is often described as kind of the fifth Beatle, George Martin, their producer, happened after repeated no's to say, okay, we're going to give this a chance, and made a few calls for them, one of which is he let them record their own music, which was not a choice a lot of producers would have made. Another was to slow down some of their early big hits in a way that made them, kind of very hard to resist. If the songs had gone faster or slower, they might not have been. He had a great sense of how to time a song. Another thing that happened was when they had a television performance for their second song, there was the biggest snowstorm in London in 100 years. So people were staying at home. And that helped vault one of their early songs to the top of the charts. If it hadn't snowed on that particular day, or if they hadn't gotten a television performance on that particular day, would the Beatles have been the Beatles? Not at all clear. And there are probably 14 other things that could be recited of the sort that I'm singled out that were necessary conditions for the Beatles to become, massive cultural and economic successes.
In the book, Cass, you also explore informational cascades and network effects as mechanisms that can amplify fame. Could you explain those two concepts for our audience and how they operate in the context of becoming famous?
Okay, so let's go back, shall we, to 2012 when Taylor Swift was pretty big, but nothing like she was now. I was part of a group of people, as, many millions were, who heard from someone. There's someone who's really good. Her name's Taylor Swift. She's country music, but she's something special, and you should listen to her. And I heard Taylor Swift because someone told me, listen to Taylor Swift. I thought she was great. Then I started telling lots and lots of people that Taylor Swift is great. Now, Taylor Swift emphatically didn't need me. She was, she didn't need a law professor to help. But the role that
Voilà, normalement, là, je parle sur Canal Anglais, tu devrais me recevoir normalement.
in transmitting to, let's say, each of the zillion to somewhere between 10 and 40 people. Enthusiasm for Taylor Swift is what accounts for Taylor Swift's success. It's word of mouth. And the informational cascade means someone transmits information to another person who transmits it to another. And then the third person is maybe not knowing a whole lot about Taylor Swift or about the new iPad or about some product, but informed by the first two. The third person goes along with their judgment, and then a fourth person who knows about the other three would have to have a lot of reasons for skepticism about the product or about the iPad or about Taylor Swift to dismiss the indication that this is a really good thing. So we see informational cascades occurring on YouTube, on TikTok, in neighborhoods, the rise of existentialism in France and across the world. There was an informational cascade. I was actually part of the existentialist informational cascade long ago. And for business success, for political success, Barack Obama was a beneficiary of an informational cascade. I worked on his campaign. I could see it in real time. And this is also true of Donald Trump. It's true of Margaret Thatcher. It's true of many politicians, whether you like them or not so much, all over the world. A network effect, let's talk a little bit about Star Wars, shall we? Where a lot of people who went to see Star Wars in various iterations of Star Wars or who were watching it on television did so not only because they had information from others suggesting it was probably good, but because they wanted to be a part of a network of people who watch Star Wars. And to be not part of that network would be to be excluded from a social phenomenon. So there's a network, let's call it the Donald Trump network, in which many people who were in it, they maybe love Trump, they maybe like Trump, but what they really like, it's network. And this is true for many successes where the product is liked or loved or appreciated, but what people really want is to be part of a network. Jane Austen, who is, the great English novelist who became a success, a spectacular success decades after she died, there's really a phenomenon of Jane Austen mania. And a lot of it is the network, where people like being part of a group of people who appreciate and talk about Jane Austen. I was on a podcast, a Taylor Swift podcast, and we talked about, not shockingly, Taylor Swift. And what the host of the podcast emphasizes exactly your point, that they love being part of the Taylor Swift network. It gives them joy and a feeling of commonality, of partnership. They also really like Taylor Swift, but the network is a crucial part of their fandom.
Great. On the other side, group polarization is another critical factor that you mentioned. How does the intensification of collective enthusiasm contribute to fame, and what are some real-world examples of that phenomenon?
Okay, so group polarization is really cool, and let's give a political example and then some cultural examples that have to do with fame and success. Suppose you get a group of people, in Germany who are talking about some issue. Let's say it's immigration. And let's suppose the median person in the group is very worried that there's too much immigration and it's doing something cultural or economic that's bad. And let's say the group has 8 people. And let's say 3 of them are also worried about immigration, 5 of them are, and 3 of them are very worried about immigration. What's going to happen to the group's opinion as the 8 people talk with one another? Here's the regularity. Groups tend to end up in a more extreme position, in line with the median tendency before they started to talk. And I saw this in government, where if you have a group of people who are inclined to take a risk in government, the likelihood that the group's decision will be in favor of that risk is really high. People will get more unified, more confident, and more extreme. It can also work the opposite way in favor of caution in business or in politics. Okay, now let's talk about fame and culture. If you get a group of people who are, let's say, pretty enthusiastic about Charles Dickens, they tend to think Charles Dickens is good. As they speak with one another, their enthusiasm for Charles Dickens will jump. They will become more extreme in their liking of Charles Dickens. And it might be that if the 8 people in, let's say, a Charles Dickens book club talk to one another enough, they're going to go absolutely crazy for Charles Dickens.
Cass, your academic side definitely comes out in the book, and you draw from experimental psychology and behavioral science to analyze fame. What are some of maybe the most surprising or counterintuitive findings from this research into fame and notoriety?
I'll tell you a story. It's an academic story that captures the big surprise for me. A few years ago, I had a student, a brilliant student, saying that she wanted to interview some large number of the most successful or famous people and ask them a battery of questions and see what they had in common. So she wanted to go to the heads of companies, she wanted to go to rock singers, she wanted to go to literary figures, and just figure out what they had in common. And she was brilliant and extremely energetic and likable. So the idea that she could have gotten interviews with these people, I think that was very realistic. Uncommonly realistic. But I had an intuition that there was something wrong with this project. And I called Danny Kahneman, recently died, one of my co-authors and heroes, and I told him about the project, and I said, there's something wrong with this, I think. And he said, oh, it's terrible. It's a terrible project. And I said, well, can you help me out? What am I not specifying in my own mind? And he said, she's sampling on the dependent variable. And that means that you sample on a variable, you take the successful people and see what they shared in common, but you don't look at the unsuccessful people and see if they have the same characteristic as well. So it might be she isolates 5 things that unify the 97 people she interviews, but there are 97,000 people who have those characteristics that we've never heard of. And that is counterintuitive. And I think it's profound about behavioral science and the human mind that we tend to think in causal terms about narratives with some cause producing something. But the world is actually really noisy. And this is the book I did with Danny and Olivier Sibony on noise, where noise has to do with variability in judgment. That's what our focus was about. But there's variability in outcomes where there's a lot of noise out there. And the fact that someone really makes it and someone else doesn't is intuitively attributable to the amazingness of the successful and the non-amazingness of the less successful. And that might be true. But it might be it's just the black box of serendipity. When I worked for President Obama, I actually talked to him about this very recently. He raised it. I didn't. I gave him a copy of the book. And when I had dinner with him when he was president one day, he said, CEOs think I don't like them. He was just kind of pondering. And he said, they think I don't like them. He said, that's not all true. I like them. They're great. They're amazing. I have only admiration for CEOs as such. But then he said, what they don't get, and which does bother me a bit, is the fact that their spectacular success had to do with good fortune, not just amazingness. And then he said, look at me. My name's Barack Obama. I got to be president. And then he said, I hope I'm doing a good job. I hope I'm good at it. But the number of things that had to work out right for me to become president, I'm very alert to that. And some CEOs aren't. And when I saw him, pretty recently, just a few weeks ago, he said almost the same words he said back in 2011 or something, but in much more detail. I had a chance to talk to him at some length, and he just went on in detail about the role of this in life. And there are ways you can increase the chances. So that's another thing I learned in the course of the book. But the most counterintuitive is that the existence of noise in success and failure, it's a lot bigger than I thought before I started.
Well, let's go there, Cass. We have many business leaders in our audience, and I'd like for us to discuss how they might draw inspiration from the lessons in the book. How can a business leader or a manager within an organization, public, private, draw inspiration from these concepts we discussed? Maybe serendipity is somewhat out of our control, I don't know, but polarization, network effects, to increase their visibility, to improve their reputation, or more generally just the attractiveness of their brands or their personal brand to strengthen the prominence and influence of their organization. Any tips?
The headline answer is be like Stan Lee. Stan Lee was the brain behind Marvel Comics, who made approximately an infinite amount of money, and it's still growing. He was the creator of Spider-Man. He was the creator of Fantastic Four. He was the creator of Thor. He was the creator of the Black Panther. He was the creator of the Avengers. He was the creator of many others that have been basically economic powerhouses now for a long time. Now, for any one of us to create the Hulk or Fantastic Four or Spider-Man, that's hard. So be like Stan Lee. He was brilliant, it turned out, not in his 20s and not in his 30s, but in his 40s and 50s and 60s and 70s. He was brilliant at energizing audiences by fueling network effects, group polarization, informational cascades, reputational cascades, and a sense on the part of consumers, let's call purchasers of his product, in this case, improbably comic books, of being part of a group of people who knew something that no one else did. And that is the amazingness of the product. Now, how did he fuel informational cascades? He created formally or informally groups of people who would talk to each other, who would say, this is great, Spider-Man's incredible. He would give people a sense of identity, that they were part of a group of people who were enjoying something really, really cool. He gave people a sense that they were part of a network of people who were, in some sense unified by something. And he gave people a sense, of course, that the product was really great. Now, if we're looking for a business proper parallel to Stan Lee, Steve Jobs was very similar. What he did with Apple was not just produce a product, which I think is really, really good, but to give people a sense of identity, maybe being insurgents, maybe rebels in some sense by virtue of the fact that they were that. Now, it depends, of course, on what your product is, but to see the importance of the affective connection with the product. There's a great paper by Paul Slovic, a terrific behavioral economist, called The Affect Heuristic. And Danny Kahneman actually once told me, the one paper I wish I'd written is The Affect Heuristic. He said, he and Amos Tversky worked a lot on heuristics. He said, we didn't see that, the affect heuristic, where people's affective feeling, let's say, about something often helps determine their judgments about the thing. So if you love, let's say, a refrigerator, it just makes you smile, the refrigerator, then all of the characteristics of the refrigerator are going to seem good. And what drives your judgment about the characteristics is your initial thought, this is amazing. And I'm hopeful that everyone who's listening to this, if they're in business, there's some product they're connected with where this is either being done or doable. Now, you can do this, I see it done in publishing, where Stephen King, the immensely successful author, there's an affective sense when a Stephen King novel comes out, which is, oh my gosh, I'm going to be thrilled and I'm going to be moved. And even if Stephen King's novel is not that good, which is rare, it hasn't never happened, but it has happened. He's done some that aren't that good. People still get it. Of course, they're going to read it, because their affective connection with King is very, very powerful.
Cass, we are nearly at the end of our conversation. More than 15 years after the publication of Nudge and the fantastic global rise in the application of behavioral science, what do you see as the key challenges and opportunities for applying behavioral science in the coming years?
That's a great question. So the opportunity for 2024, 2025, probably 2026, is the reduction of sludge, understood as administrative barriers or burdens that make it hard for people to get what they want. And this has been a global phenomenon in the last 12 months, where the OECD, governments all over the world, private enterprises, hospitals, CEOs have gone hard at administrative burdens or barriers that often have a surprisingly large negative effect on people with whom they interact. So to do a sludge audit at a company, I've seen this being done. It can be formal or informal. This is a fantastic opportunity, short run, for a government, let's say, to serve its people better. The U.S. government recently released a report on administrative burdens and time taxes, as they're sometimes called, and for the private sector to work at reducing sludge, administrative burdens, which are sometimes, very bad for the company because the clients and employees don't like the company as much and they don't buy the products or they leave the company. Or it can be, for some companies, it's kind of effective to use sludge to kind of trap consumers in the short term, but in the long term, that's not a profit-making strategy. So I see this as growth area number one.
Maybe in the long term?
Well, in the long term, I think you put your finger on it with AI. And the fact is that AI is even now overcoming behavioral problems or challenges that human beings face. It's helping to address behavioral biases. It's helping also, and this is more long-term fascinating, to help us learn about ourselves. So AI, early days, it's helping to identify behavioral biases that no business and no economist and no psychologist has found yet. So if you have huge data sets about people's behavior, you can learn something about what we react to, that it may be great. We may learn that, human beings really handle certain situations fantastically well, or you might learn that people show certain biases and certain susceptibility we didn't even know about. There's one recent-ish paper that does this, which shows in giving bail, deciding to which people should get bail and which people should stay in prison, algorithms, AI, outperforms judges. They just do better. They make better choices. Why is that? Okay. The recent work finds that the thing human judges show is the picture of the defendant plays an outside role in the judge's decision. Not is the person male or female, black or white, but does the person have a very messy face? First, a very messy face. Human judges tend to think, I'm going to keep you in prison. The algorithm is less attentive to that. Now, that just uncovers a bias we never knew about. And it's not what intuition suggests. Intuition might suggest, maybe age or demographics matter. No, it's what the face looks like. I have a slightly bruised face right now, so from a sports injury, so I better not commit a crime. I might not get bail.
We'll get you bail, don't worry. Thanks so much, Cass, for all these valuable insights. Before we conclude, any final message or advice to share with our audience of business leaders and behavioral science enthusiasts?
Yes, I do have a final thought, which is if a result of these sessions is to produce an action plan that, let's say, involves doing 2 things in the next 3 months that one otherwise wouldn't have done, then we have not just a success, but a spectacular success. And I am willing to participate in a pact with everyone who's listening. I will do 2 things I would not otherwise do because of this conversation that we hope will be beneficial to people. And maybe we all can choose 2 things.
Great. Thanks so much, Cass. That's really useful advice. And for our attendees, we're only getting started for the Human Advantage 2024. Stay tuned as we speak with many more thought leaders, from academics to business leaders working in the field.
Well, I have the results from our Spark Notes poll, and I'm a little bit worried to share the results. 52% of you are Team Miley Cyrus, and 48% of you are Swifties. But I don't want to wake up the Swiftie army, because I think that can be quite a dangerous proposition.
Okay, if you want to know more, we highly recommend to read this book from Cass, and you will know how to become famous.